The day my wife laughed at me in front of her friends and called me a poor CEO. I didn't defend myself. I simply smiled and stayed quiet. She thought I was struggling to keep my company alive, driving an old car and living like an ordinary man. What she didn't know was that the company she believed I barely controlled was actually mine. Every office, every major decision, every dollar of profit led back to me, and soon she was going to discover the truth in the most unexpected way. For years I had watched my wife become more embarrassed by the way I lived. She knew I was the CCO of a successful company, but she never understood why I drove an old sedan, wore simple suits, and avoided expensive restaurants whenever possible. To her, a CEO was supposed to look powerful everywhere he went. She wanted luxury cars, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and a lifestyle that would impress everyone around us. I never argued with her. I simply told her that I preferred a quiet life and that money did not need to be displayed to have value. She thought that was an excuse because she had convinced herself that my company was struggling. One evening, she invited several of her wealthy friends to our home for dinner. I had just returned from the office, still wearing the same simple suit I had worn that morning. As I walked into the dining room, I heard her laughing about me. She told her friends that being married to a poor CEO was not as glamorous as people imagined. Everyone laughed, and for a moment, the room became painfully quiet when they realized I had heard everything. I looked at my wife, but instead of becoming angry, I calmly pulled out a chair and sat down. She continued, explaining that I had become obsessed with saving money because my business was supposedly barely surviving. One of her friends even asked how long I expected the company to remain profitable. I simply smiled and said that the company was doing better than they realized. My wife rolled her eyes and told everyone I was always pretending everything was fine. What none of them knew was that the lifestyle they were mocking had been a choice. I had built my company from the ground up years earlier, and when investors eventually came in, I structured the ownership carefully through private holding companies. The public believed I was simply the CEO hired to manage the business, while the real ownership remained hidden from almost everyone outside a small circle of trusted advisors. My wife had never bothered to ask about the legal structure, the shares, or the decisions that ultimately belonged to me, and that night, as she continued, laughing about my supposedly empty bank account, I realized just how completely she had misunderstood the man sitting beside her. What my wife did not understand was that the company's public image told only a small part of the story. She saw me as the man who arrived early, left late, wore inexpensive watches, and rarely talked about money. She assumed those habits meant I was struggling. In reality, they were the result of a decision I had made years earlier, when the company was nothing more than a small office with a handful of employees. I had learned very quickly that owning a successful business and looking wealthy were two completely different things. Instead of spending every dollar on appearances, I reinvested the profits into the company, acquired additional shares, and gradually strengthened my position until my ownership became far greater than anyone outside my legal team realized. Even some senior employees believed I was simply the chief executive responsible for running the business on behalf of investors. The paperwork, however, told a very different story. Several private holding companies had been established under my control, allowing my ownership to remain largely out of the public spotlight. I never used that information to impress anyone because I believed that real wealth did not need an audience. My wife had never seen the confidential documents, and I had never felt the need to show them to her. Whenever she complained that we were living below our means, I would remind her that we could afford much more, but did not need to spend it. She interpreted that as weakness. She began comparing me with other husbands whose expensive cars and luxury homes were visible to everyone. At social gatherings, she would sometimes introduce me with a joking smile and say, "He is the CEO, but you would never know it." People laughed because they believed she was making a harmless joke. I knew she was revealing how little she understood about my life. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I continued making major decisions that shaped the company's future. I approved acquisitions, negotiated strategic partnerships, and reviewed financial reports that showed the business was becoming more valuable every year. My legal advisors regularly reminded me that my ownership position gave me extraordinary control, but I kept everything private. I had no interest in proving myself to strangers, and I certainly did not expect to have to prove myself to my wife. Yet, as her comments became more frequent and her respect for me slowly disappeared, I began wondering how long I could continue protecting a secret that was becoming harder to keep. As the months passed, my wife's attitude changed in ways I could no longer ignore. She started spending more time with people who measured success by expensive cars, luxury homes, private clubs, and impressive business connections. Whenever we attended dinner parties, she seemed uncomfortable if I arrived in my old sedan instead of something more expensive. She would glance at other men's watches and jackets before looking at mine, and sometimes she would quietly ask why I could not live like them if I was really as successful as I claimed. I tried to explain that my priorities were different, but she had already decided what she believed. To her, success had to be visible. One evening, after another uncomfortable gathering, she confronted me in the kitchen. She said she was tired of pretending that everything was fine and accused me of holding her back. According to her, being married to a CEO should have opened doors to a better lifestyle, but instead she felt embarrassed whenever people discovered how simply we lived. I listened without interrupting as she compared me with the husbands of her friends. She mentioned one man who had recently bought a luxury apartment and another who had purchased a new sports car. Then she looked directly at me and said that perhaps I was not as successful as everyone thought. Those words stayed with me because I knew the truth. She did not. The company was expanding into new markets. Profits were increasing, and the value of the business had reached a level she could hardly imagine. But instead of supporting me, she had begun treating my modest lifestyle as evidence of failure. Her friends encouraged that thinking. They told her she deserved more and suggested that a woman married to a powerful CEO should never have to worry about appearances. Eventually, she began questioning every financial decision I made. She complained when I refused to buy a luxury vehicle and became irritated when I chose to invest extra money into the business. What she did not realize was that every major investment was increasing the value of something I already owned. While she believed I was sacrificing our lifestyle because the company needed money, I knew I was building an empire quietly. I could have ended every argument with a single conversation and shown her the ownership documents. But something stopped me. I wanted to understand whether she loved the man I was when she thought I had very little, or whether she had become attached to the image of wealth she expected from a powerful husband, and her next decision was about to make that answer impossible to ignore. The moment everything changed came on a Monday morning when the company announced an emergency board meeting. A major acquisition had reached its final stage, and several senior executives, investors, and legal advisors were expected to attend. My wife happened to be invited because she had been involved in a charity event sponsored by the company, and she assumed the meeting would be another opportunity to meet influential people. She arrived dressed for the occasion, expecting to see wealthy investors and powerful executives surrounding me. I arrived quietly, carrying a simple folder and wearing the same kind of suit I had worn countless times before. As we entered the conference room, several executives greeted me respectfully. My wife noticed the way they spoke to me, but she still believed I was simply the CEO managing the company for its owners. Then the chief legal advisor stood up and asked everyone to take their seats because the final ownership documents were ready for review. My wife barely paid attention until the lawyer mentioned the controlling ownership structure. He explained that the majority of the company's shares were held through private entities controlled by one individual. Then he looked directly at me and addressed me as the principal owner. The room became silent. My wife slowly turned toward me, her expression changing from confusion to disbelief. She asked the lawyer if he was referring to me. He calmly confirmed that I controlled the holding companies and therefore held the decisive ownership position in the entire business. She stared at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. The same man she had called a poor CEO was not struggling to keep the company alive. He was the person who had built it, funded its growth, and maintained control over its future. One executive then presented a financial report showing the company's extraordinary growth over the previous several years. My wife looked at the numbers, then at me, clearly trying to understand how she had missed something so important. She remembered every time she had complained about my old car, every joke she had made about my simple clothes, and every occasion when she had told her friends that I was not as successful as people assumed. Now those words seemed to echo through the conference room. I did not embarrass her or raise my voice. I simply remained seated while the lawyers continued explaining the ownership structure, the acquisition, and the decisions that required my approval. And for the first time, she understood that the quiet life she had mocked was never proof that I lacked wealth. It was proof that I had never needed to display it after the meeting. My wife followed me into the hallway without saying a word. The confidence she had carried into the building that morning was gone, replaced by uncertainty and embarrassment. She finally asked why I had never told her the truth about the company. I looked at her and explained that I had never tried to deceive her. I simply never believed that my financial position should determine how she treated me. I wanted to know that she respected me for who I was, not for the size of my bank account or the number of shares I controlled. She became emotional and said she had made mistakes. She admitted that she had allowed her friends to influence her, and that she had become obsessed with appearances. She remembered the dinners where she had compared me with other husbands, the jokes she had made about my old car, and the times she had called me a poor CEO in front of people who knew nothing about our private life. She said she was ashamed and asked whether we could start over. I listened carefully, but I did not immediately give her the answer she wanted. For years, I had believed that silence protected our marriage from unnecessary pressure. Now I understood that silence had also allowed resentment to grow. I told her that money had never been the problem. The real problem was respect. If she had been unhappy with our lifestyle, she could have spoken honestly with me, instead of humiliating me in front of others. She could have asked questions, instead of making assumptions. She could have supported my decisions, instead of treating every modest choice as evidence of failure. She apologized again. But this time I asked her a difficult question. If the lawyers had never revealed my ownership, would she still have wanted to stay married to me? She became quiet because she knew there was no easy answer. The truth was now impossible to hide. But I also knew that revealing my wealth could not automatically repair the damage between us. I had spent years building the company with patience, discipline, and trust, and I realized that those same values mattered in a marriage. I told her that I would not punish her for making mistakes, but I also would not pretend they had never happened. If we were going to rebuild anything, it would have to begin with honesty rather than money. From that day forward, the company remained mine, but the greater question was whether our marriage could survive after the illusion she had built around my life finally disappeared, and whether she could learn to value the man she had underestimated long before she discovered what he owned.